Welcome to Future Ready Live, where we talk about topics that will help CPAs, CGMAs, finance and accounting pros prepare for change and transformation. Today, we're going to be talking about the future of finance, and joining me is David Axson, probably well known to many of you, known as the CFO Whisperer. He's a researcher, educator, and advisor for the past decade. After retiring from Accenture Strategy. He also served as a corporate planning at Bank of America and was a co-founder and COO of the Hackett Group, where he led the firm from startup to IPO. And you might remember, we just recently had an interview with Hackett and Nili Asades about learning and their latest survey. He's advised on strategy, finance, and technology for more than 35 years, helping in businesses in more than 50 countries. David, say hello to our audience.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you all. Thank you for having me on.
I've been really looking forward to this. David and I caught up not too long ago, and I said, we got to have you on Future Ready Live. So obviously, he's also a well-known author. He's got a few books published, so just a wealth of knowledge. That's why I'm excited to be talking to you today, David. I want to start with probably the obvious question, at least for me, is what the heck is a CFO Whisperer and how did you get that name?
I'm not actually sure. I've been very fortunate to work with CFOs for, as you said, almost 35 years now. This was that title actually given to me by one of my clients who said, the way you work with your clients is very much in a coaching and advisory role. You're not trying to put yourself front and center. You're challenging and provocative, but you do it in a way that is hopefully constructive. So I'll take that as a compliment. And it's always nice when a client comes up with a nickname for you that is actually quite good rather than one that is perhaps a little more negative, shall we say.
I hear you. Well, so that's one of those like sticky concepts. You ought to be using that hashtag, by the way, because that's a winner in my opinion. So with all that experience, you've been in the strategy consulting side with Accenture. Obviously, before that, founded the Hackett Group, focused on finance for years. So how has the role of finance changed in recent years, and especially the last 18 months as a result of COVID?
Yeah, obviously we've been in a multi-decade transformation. I actually feel today that transformation is a journey that doesn't end rather than a project. There are a lot of finance transformation projects out there, but in many cases, once you finish one, you're starting on the next generation. Whether that was general ledger systems, ERP, data warehousing, process re-engineering, going digital, whatever it may be. There's always something on the horizon. I think there are two major changes I've seen in the role of finance, both of which have accelerated in the last 18 months or so. One is very much a pivot to the future. As we've increasingly automated the routine activity of accounting, it really has forced and in many ways liberated the finance professionals to start looking forwards rather than backwards. We can't change history. We can try and shape the future. And I think that's a very liberating role for a finance professional, but it can also be a little unnerving. When I train as an accountant, the very word means looking backwards. When you train as an accountant, things add up, they balance, they're right, and more detail equals more accuracy. As soon as you pivot to the future, all those bets are off. Uncertainty is the name of the game. More detail actually probably equals more inaccuracy. I always like to say to people, the more detailed your budget, the more variances you're going to have, because your crystal ball simply isn't that good. But I think it's a very exciting role that allows us to begin to bring to bear our skills around understanding data, our skills around understanding variability and uncertainty, but it also puts us much more towards the front of the decision-making process in terms of where resources are going to be allocated. Are we getting an adequate or better than expected return from those investments that we're making? And are we really helping the organization execute against its strategy, mission, and vision? The second element, I think, that's changed, which is very much related to the first, is finance has come out of its box. It's no longer limited to closing the books at the end of the month and generating stacks of financial reports. It's much more integrated into the overall business of the organization. You can see that in the number of CFOs who move into the corner office, but also, every earnings call of a public company, the two mainstays are always the CEO and the CFO. And the CEO is talking about strategy and innovation and market presence. And the CFO is telling the financial story that goes along with that. So there's a symbiosis there between the CEO and the CFO role that I think is increasingly critical. And what we've begun to see is that relationship is cascading down the finance organization. Instead of finance being locked away, analyzing budget variances or creating management reports, we're sitting in conversations with business leadership on choices, on strategies, on where to place bets and where to perhaps take bets off. And I think over the last 18 months, that has really come to the fore. Finances, I think, excel in what has been an unprecedented period. The ability to conserve cash and capital and maintain strength in balance sheets, the relatively mild impact on many companies of what has been an unprecedented economic turbulence, if you like, I think really is a testament to the discipline that finance executives bring to the table, and also has really accelerated finance chiefs' understanding of the value that their digital investments can bring. When you're having to close the books from home, it creates a different mindset. No longer are your colleagues sitting across the cube in the office. They're sitting hundreds of miles away in many cases, in some cases on a different continent. And, I was speaking with a CFO just a few weeks ago, and she made the comment that perversely to her, but in hindsight, very obviously, collaboration has actually improved. The engagement through tools like Zoom and Teams and platforms like LinkedIn, is really creating an opportunity to engage with people that perhaps when they were just down the corridor in the office, you ignored them. So this forced interaction that remoteness has really initiated has changed the landscape. And I think there will be lessons to be learned. We will begin to migrate back and some of the old ways will reestablish themselves. But there are going to be some permanent structural changes in the way we think about finance, the way we think about talent, and the way we think about integration, communication, and collaboration across the enterprise. So I've actually been very heartened. I remember back to Black Monday in 1987 and the dot-com crash at the end of the 90s. They had a much more significant impact over a longer period of time than either the financial crisis of 10 years ago or the global pandemic that we're still experiencing the tail of today.
Yeah. So I just could take notes on everything you said there. You had some great concepts. This idea of, we're calling it value partnering. You're exactly right. We've shifted from the rear view mirror to the windshield view. And now I read one survey that said in the middle of March of last year, at the height of the pandemic, finance teams were being asked to project and reproject something like 30 times more than they ever had before. So that, like you said, that put them in a unique spot. The other thing I thought is fascinating is Edelman came out with a survey, the trust survey they do every year. And they said, who are the average people in businesses, in organizations trusting the most? And they said, first was the CFO, and CEO was actually second. But apparently the CFO showed up in a lot of, I'm sure, the policies and obviously the financial side, and the people in the organizations relished that voice. And so that's an example of that CFO moving into that front, I like to say, co-pilot seat, if you will. And you're exactly right. So I think that's encouraging because we've been talking about that for a while, but I think the technology is accelerated to now that might be real. Is that what you're seeing as well?
I would say very much the case. It's sort of liberated the finance professional from the tyranny of the spreadsheet. We spent all of our time manipulating numbers and organizing them and dropping them into PowerPoint slides and calling it a report. So we had relatively little time to sit down and engage in dialogue and debate with business leadership. And that's really where innovation and creativity comes from. And it may sound strange to use innovation and creativity in the context of finance, but that really is where we're going. To the trust element, I think, one of the things that's driven that is actually been much to, many CFOs may decry it, but actually the increased compliance burden and the expansion of compliance and regulatory to things like environmental health and safety, renewability and sustainability, all of which the CFO has a finger in. And so I think the trust issue is somewhat predicated on the control, safe pair of hands, the need to be a trusted advisor, but also job one for every CFO still remains ensuring the integrity of the financial statements.
Yeah.
If they don't do that well, they can end up in jail. And if we ever lose sight of that, the ability to play this expanded role that is interesting and exciting will be lost. So we must never lose sight of our primary goal and mission.
Yeah, you make a great point there. The whole stewardship piece of our profession is essential. Obviously, that's what got us through this point. And you're right, no matter how much we get into the helping look forward, we have to make sure the back door is closed, right? And we've got it all tied up nice. So spot on. Now, you talked about the idea of the CFO in more of this value-adding notion. Tell me a little bit about how you're seeing the finance team evolve with helping being a catalyst for growth, right? A good friend of mine who was the controller for McCormick, he's now retired, Ken Kelly, he used to say, we're moving from being bean counters to bean growers. Now, that was very appropriate for the spice company.
Yes.
But it's a good, but how tell me about that. How are you seeing that? And what kind of things are they doing to help these businesses evaluate these kinds of investments and growth potential?
Yeah, by the way, I love that analogy. I'm probably going to steal that and use it shamelessly. To put it in the context of things that we as finance professionals live and breathe around, I think there are a couple of areas related to so-called balance sheet areas, so investing for growth. And there are a couple of areas that focus more around the P&L account, so, ongoing operations. In terms of balance sheet areas, I think the role of finance has changed significantly in terms of investment appraisal and capital allocation. So instead of simply being at the back end of the process, reviewing capital expenditure requests and telling people they don't meet the hurdle rate, finance is getting much more engaged in looking at the relationship of those investments to the strategic growth plans of the company, but also with a very strong risk and uncertainty lens about how those investments may look in the future as market conditions change. An investment that you green light on a particular day may be a red light 6 months later. And a CFO really needs to have the confidence and also the information and data necessary to go to the business and say, look, we green lighted this investment. It no longer makes sense. We should pivot. We should reduce the resources we're investing in that initiative and redirect them to something that has a better value. So that's really around investment and capital allocation. I think the second piece is fundamental around cash and capital management. So yeah, you've allocated the capital, but what are we doing to ensure that we have the working capital, but also the investment capital available to support growth initiatives? We've seen a lot of companies, and it was very interesting, the speed with which CFOs and boards cut back on share repurchases and dividend payouts early in the crisis last year, which was a way of shoring up balance sheets. But what it also did was provide capacity for many businesses to pivot, to adapt to new ways of doing business as a result of the pandemic, whether that's at-home delivery, moving more online, investment to facilitate remote working from the workforce, repositioning supply chains to reduce dependency on extended supply or single supplier relationships. All of those things take time and money. So the ability to manage cash and capital and manage investment from the balance sheet standpoint is taking a much more active role rather than simply counting the beans. We're trying to grow the beans, so to speak. On the P&L side of it, there are two elements. The traditional one has always been expense management. And again, we saw that in terms of the traditional processes of cutting down on travel and training and those types of things, discretionary investments that some people perceive. And finance has always done a decent job around that. We've seen the emergence of newer tools like zero-based budgeting, although for people like you and I, that's probably a reappearance of something that existed 30 years ago in a different form. But expense control has always been at the heart. But increasingly, we've seen that move upstream into margin management. So really beginning to understand pricing dynamics within an industry.
Yeah.
And as we've seen the value proposition from a company to its customers change through the pandemic, a lot of those relationships have changed. But the advantage of the data and analytics tools we now have is we can bring much greater discipline, a much greater modeling capability to margin management questions than we have previously done. So while balance sheet and P&L may sound old world, I think it's been active on those dimensions around investments, cash and capital, margin, and expenses.
Yeah, I think so. Spot on. Now, talk about a little bit what we just had a major. We've got a group of CFOs and an advisory group, and one of the things they started to talk about was the impact of intangibles and how finance is dealing with that. What do you think about that? What's your kind of perspective on that and where that's going in terms of the profession?
It's interesting. It's been true for quite a number of years now that the enterprise value bears virtually no relation to the hard asset value as recorded on a balance sheet. We've been in that situation for a long time. It started off largely around brand, companies like a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi or whatever, and people started talking about brand value. It's evolved significantly in the last few years where things like network value, things like the value of a customer enterprise, the things like the value of an information asset, that aren't recorded in traditional balance sheet numbers. So I actually think, we've been living in that world for quite a long time. My own personal view is I'm not sure there is anything called an intangible asset. They're all tangible. There just may not be a piece of equipment, sitting in a factory somewhere. There's tangibility to data, there's tangibility to customer intimacy and a customer franchise. There are real things around a brand that exhibit trust and exhibit, a level of confidence that a customer community has. We may not have perfect measurement mechanisms for all of those things, but they are very, very tangible. And maybe it's an accounting rule semantics that separates tangible from intangible. But if you're not comfortable in the world of intangible asset management and making investments in intangibles where outcomes are uncertain, you're probably not going to be a very effective finance executive in the modern world.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're spot on there. And that's the conversation. I think what we have to do as a profession, though, is begin to educate or develop tools and frameworks for the CPAs who are in those corporates to be able to use those. Business model evolution, right? All those things are kind of new is what we're seeing. I mean, you're right. They've been around for a long time, except it's now becoming, I think, a clarion call, because I thought the latest stat was like 90% of the S&P market value is intangible.
Yeah.
So what you think about our remit as finance professionals, the balance sheet and income statement, 90% of that's not represented in those core numbers. So we got to get our kind of collective act together relative to that. So let's talk about, as you look into the future, give me your crystal ball out. What do you see ahead for the next 5 years?
Well, I actually think it's the single most exciting time in my career to be a finance professional. I'm just a little disappointed I'm at the end rather than the beginning of my journey, because all the things that I have a degree in accounting and computer science is so old it's obsolete, but a lot of the things that we learn in school have taken 30 years to become a reality. I started off using Lotus 123 in 1983 when I started in finance. And, basically all that changed for many people is we moved from Lotus to Excel. Finally, we're beginning to see with visualization tools, analytic tools, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the ability to really add some value to all of that. And I like to say that today, finance's job starts when we deliver the report or the analysis, because the value we deliver is a function of how well that information or that analysis is used in business decision making. In my early days, I used to breathe a big sigh of relief when I send on the email with the monthly management report saying, thank goodness that's over with for another month. Whereas really, that was actually the beginning of the end, to use a phrase, or the end of the beginning, as Winston Churchill commented about World War II. That's really the beginning, the end of our beginning. The real value we add is what happens with that information and how we use it. So I think we're still in the early stages of the technology adoption within finance. Despite the phenomenal change over the last 30 to 35 years, we're still at the beginning of that journey. Yeah. What I see as the most exciting, actually, I think it's the biggest thing that we need to think about in the next 2 years, is basically companies have taken a 2-year pause on investing in talent. Training was cancelled. Delivery mechanisms they've adapted, but are they the same as they were before, with in-person coaching and training, with teams working together and collaborating? The collaboration tools are phenomenal, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, but are they really helping us develop talent in what is still a rapidly changing world? How do people deal with uncertainty and ambiguity? How do you drive innovation when you have a decentralized finance team, 70% of whom may be working from remote locations and maybe only interact with each other face-to-face 1 or 2 days a month? These are still big open questions. Yeah. And I really think, in the environment we're operating in today, where technology has been democratized, even very small companies can access the coolest, newest technology. The very technology we're using at the moment to do this. You do not need to be an IBM or an Apple or a Google to bring this technology to bear for the benefit of your customers or your employees or your associates. So are we really focusing on what remains the one remaining differentiator? The technology will no longer be a significant differentiator. There will be patterns of that, but the windows of competitive advantage will increasingly narrow. Yep. So the differentiator will be the talent to take the value that technology potentially provides and translate it into real business value in terms of decision-making, strategy, management of ambiguity and uncertainty, agility, all of those phrases we use to describe our aspiration. So I'm really hoping that 2022 and beyond are really a decade of talent development and investment. And I think that has to reach back into education and academia, as well as the professional associations as well. We've talked about a number of areas: technology, intangibles, volatility and uncertainty, all of which change some of the, they probably destroy some of the sacred cows that we as accountants have grown up with. The annual budget, well, what is it? Is it relevant? Is it meaningful? You yourself talked about, continuous reforecasting. Well, there are some companies out there that take 10 days to build a forecast. Well, how do you do a daily forecast if it takes you 10 days to create one? These are some basic questions that we have to get our head around. And it's talent that's going to end up being the differentiator. So, my mantra for 2022 is it's the time for talent.
I love it. You're obviously a kindred spirit with us. We're in the business of trying to help that talent out, right, from a career perspective, from the universities all the way up into the high end of the career. So we are spending a lot of time on that. And I think you're right. We've kind of ignored it for 2 years. It is really time to double down, because one of the things, I forget the futurist that said this, but it basically said, if you automate, you must elevate the skills of your team. And I think that applies to finance, because now we're doubling down on automation, which is being our friend, getting the stuff, blocking and tackling that we don't need to do anymore. And you're going to need higher level skills sooner and sooner. So we're working on that program with universities as well as out in the market from that standpoint. So this has been just a refresh. I knew it was going to be an amazing conversation, but I really appreciate it. I got tons of notes. We're going to write a blog post up about it. But for all of you out there, so David, thank you very much for giving us the time today. It was amazing. And then for everyone out there, you can follow him on Twitter at David Axson, all one word, DAVIDAXSON, or visit him online at that same address, www.davidaxson.com. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on our Future Ready Live session today with David Axson. And don't miss other sessions the first and third Tuesday of every month. So with that, David, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.